Okay, part two. Did the first one in record time. Let's see if we can do record time for the human aspects. Getting started with human patterns over time. A brief history of Russia, this particular area of Russia, before the Cold War. Because we've talked about the Cold War before. We know a bit about the Cold War. I hope you do, because you're going to need to know that for the exam, because we talked about Europe, of course, and its influences, United States' influence. And we'll talk about it again here because our biggest actor, United States, essentially against the Soviet Union. Here we are meeting our nemesis, if you will. So Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown in 1917, a communist revolution. Some different actors going on here, of course, but we have the Bolsheviks that essentially take charge in the revolution. Their leader, Vladimir Lenin, I have to include his first name, so there's no confusion between, again, large Beatles fan. We can't say that that was John Lennon for anybody that would get that confused. I'd put that on the exam. Some of you would miss it. Make me quite sad that that could be a possible mix-up for you, but nonetheless, it probably would happen. So Vladimir Lenin, of course, very different. In this case, in 1922, Joseph Stalin succeeds Vladimir Lenin. Again, post that revolution, you see he's not in charge too long, 1917. Here in 1922, we already have Joseph Stalin coming to the scene, leader of the Soviet Union for decades. Not a great guy, not great for the environment, as we talked about before, sort of just wrecking down all the trees as fast as he could for human, obviously for human purposes in terms of development. But under his regime, millions of people died because he was quite ruthless. If you opposed him, you likely were sent to a gulag prison camp out in Siberia, where you mined for minerals or other hard labor, where you probably died, or he killed you, maybe not personally, although I'm sure that maybe happened, I'm not sure. But he certainly had you sent to death or prison, very brutal. Millions of people, estimations, obviously into the millions here, coupled with the millions and millions of Soviets that die as a result of World War II, a shocking amount of people. We're talking tens of millions of people from this country are dying in this time period shortly after the revolution, and of course, and going all the way to the end of World War II, the mid-1940s, before the Cold War. So you could see at the beginning of the Cold War, this is coming off of a few decades of literally millions of people dying over the course of just a few decades, and we're talking millions of people. In this estimation here, 23 million Soviets died during the course of World War II, more than the Europeans combined. That's larger than the entire state population of Florida at this moment, and so you can imagine quite devastation that would have on a particular country. So here, again, a brief synopsis. We have a revolution that takes place, a communist revolution. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, inspired by that German philosopher Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto from 1848. We talked about that in chapter 4. Continue to remember that. Later comes along Joseph Stalin, a ruthless leader, native of Georgia, the country that, again, former USSR territory, of course, but more on that importance in a moment. Pretty ruthless leader in terms of his people and his expansion, but we get through World War II, many Soviets continue to die there, and then we navigate our way further. Which brings us to the Soviet-Afghan War. Soviet Union backs an unpopular government led by Nur Mohammad Taraki. Okay, so this is the Communist Party that leads a coup in Afghanistan at this time. Unpopular, Russian-backed, another coup takes place. They're fighting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and this conflict essentially becomes a proxy war for the Cold War. Why did I have you watch the Charlie Wilson's War? A lot of you wonder, why am I watching these movies? Well, cue this slide. I'm bringing it all together, and it makes a lot of sense now because not only was that important for U.S. international relations, U.S. war, sort of how things perhaps get done in U.S. politics, but it comes up again in the Soviet Union discussion, and it'll come up again in the Afghanistan discussion, and perhaps again throughout maybe other smaller discussions. But here we go. And I don't have to speak much on this because you either didn't do well or you watched the movie and you did well. A lot of people watched the movie and a lot of people did well, and got a lot of fans now of Charlie Wilson's War. As seen there, the real life Congressman Charlie Wilson of Texas, serving in the late 1990s. We know that role that the United States played. Of course, the United States backing the Mujahideen to push back against the Soviets in Afghanistan. Other actors around the world pushed back against the Soviets by helping the Mujahideen to defeat the Soviets. And in fact, defeating the Soviets altogether happens in 1989 after a decade-long conflict in the Soviet Union taking place in Afghanistan. They retreat, and just a few short years later, the Soviet Union collapses. To recap, we have a Soviet Union backing an unpopular communist government in Afghanistan. The Mujahideen come in and fight. The United States and other actors back the Mujahideen because we don't like the Soviets, because of the Cold War at the time. Again, communists versus capitalists, and other little factors happening there, not to oversimplify. The Mujahideen run the Soviets out of Afghanistan. 10 years, they fail, and the Soviet Union shortly thereafter collapses. Very important in terms of U.S.-Russian relations at the time, Soviet-Afghan relations at the time, and other actors around the world that took place in this proxy war. Globalization and development. A move toward privatization in Russia after all this state control. So we have, of course, during the Soviet Union, we have communism, we have socialism. It falls, it fails. Coming out into the 1990s, privatization process attempts to take place at the fall of the Soviet Union, and it created an environment that benefited the uber wealthy and the well-connected bureaucrats at the time. They scarf up this stuff for cheap, and it creates what we consider an oligarchy. And oligarchs are very wealthy people. An oligarchy is a situation in which there's a very wealthy have control over the resources and therefore often the power. It's often used to refer to the Russian government here because, again, this chapter is discussing 12 different countries. In this context, we're referring to Russia as an oligarchy and the oligarchs of Russia that come to power really in that privatization process that takes place. Some of these policies that try to take place at this time happen so rapidly, or their mission is to convert the economy very rapidly, referred to as shock therapy, perhaps in a different sense than what we may originally think of shock therapy, but attempts to revitalize the economy. But unfortunately, like we see in other societies during some sort of economic restructurement, is that money goes to the top so much percent in Russia, and the wealthiest of Russians become even more wealthy. And so we see wages rise from 1991 to later years, but those essentially are coming not at the bottom but to the top. And so again, creates this economic disparity in Russia, which trickles down into different other sectors that we'll touch on in a moment. Brings us to the Russia-Ukraine gas dispute. The dispute, but actually happening several different disputes, 1990s, dwelled into the early 2000s, in 2009, and then even some into the 2010s and plus. Again, series of disagreements between Russia and the Ukraine, and really issues surrounding, obviously, gas, but in terms of its pricing, its supply, and its transport. Obviously, we talked about before, Russia relying on a lot of sales of natural gas and oil to the European Union. A lot of those pipelines you can see has to go through the Ukraine, and that creates a problem for the Russians at different times. Gazprom is the world's largest gas company. It's a Russian gas company, and so again, this is a company that's used in a lot of geopolitical navigations as, again, state-controlled. So the Russians use Gazprom for manipulations and geopolitical conflicts, if you will, throughout this gas dispute, throughout the many years. The Russians controlled different supplies that affected some countries in Central Eastern Europe, they actually essentially had lower supplies in different years, again, coming at an inopportune time in winter, and so different agreements have been met. Obviously, this sort of compiles all the way up to the Ukraine crisis starting in 2014, and that's where it's sort of left out in this context in the book, and we'll pursue a little bit more of that Russia-Ukraine dynamic later on in the presentation. Okay, tossed out. Russia was suspended from the G8, or the Group of Eight, in 2014 by them trying to steal Crimea, and we'll break this down in just a moment. So it becomes the G7, now we know it as the G7, was the G8 from 1997 to 2014. It was the G8, included Russia, some European countries, Canada, the United States, and Japan. Russia annexes Crimea, part of the Ukraine when Ukraine has its crisis. The Russians consider that an opportune time to go in and try to acquire Crimea, an area that was historically part of their territory. They try to take that. Of course, world leaders that produce freedom and democracy don't really like that idea, of course. And so they say, you're suspended. Russians come back and say, it's fine, we want to leave anyways, and we don't want to not only be suspended, but we're essentially going to never pursue coming back. So they permanently leave the group. So we go from the G8 back to the G7, 2014. And that's where we come, again, we've been talking about these BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And Russia is using that as sort of the alternative. They can't play with these guys and gals. And so they have to go find other people to, in fact, trade with and negotiate with. And so they find these BRICS countries to counterbalance that of the geopolitical power of the G7. Now, development in this region varies, of course. Region as a whole, very corrupt. Institutionalized corruption takes place, not just in Russia, but the Central Asian states, particularly as well, even into the Caucasus region. Nearly 40% of the Russian economy is in the informal sector, and that's even lower than what it is in the Central Asian states. Central Asian states, the informal economy, maybe upwards of 50 to 60% by estimates. And the informal economy, as we talked about before, is something that falls outside of what would be the formal economy. So the informal economy is, for instance, and the book even says it, making vodka out of your bathtub. If that isn't a stereotype for Russia, I don't know what is, but the book uses it. I'm not making that up. But again, selling some different products that's made from within the own home, canning fruits and vegetables and selling it on the street, some jobs in transportation, other sorts of economies that may or may not be legal. And so that's situated in the informal economy, a major part of the Russian economy. And it may, in fact, be more beneficial for those folks to be in that sector for their own financial benefit. Now, we talk about agriculture. Only 10% of that massive country of Russia is suitable for agriculture. And so a lot of people have small family gardens and farms. Again, some different relationships exist between the types of farming that takes place in the Ukraine regarding imports and exports. Now that there's a crisis going on there, obviously a different situation. Some citrus fruit and some of those Mediterranean type agriculture that came from the Caucasus region used to go to Russia at a time. They've been looking a little bit more westward in terms of the European Union and Europe. And so that area, again, a point of contention. That brings us to the crisis in Ukraine. So before the crisis in Ukraine broke out, there were some color revolutions that took place throughout the region, not in Ukraine specifically, but in places like Georgia and otherwise, in 2003 and 3 through 5 and 5. And so it's important to know, because that comes sort of as a predecessor to the crisis in Ukraine that the Russians are dealing with in terms of these post-Soviet states. Now, there's a geographic division in the Ukraine between west and east, essentially. And so when you have the country of Ukraine situated between Central Europe and Russia, those in the eastern part of the Ukraine, some of them even ethnic Russians, although they would consider themselves in sometimes ethnic Ukrainians, but they speak Russian, or again, ethnic Russians, they tend to obviously favor the Russian Federation in terms of their geopolitical or economic connections their biases. While those in the West, of course, some just miles away from places like Poland and Slovakia and other countries in the European Union already, and so they obviously tend to favor incorporation into the European Union and being a friend and ally of that of Europe. And so you have this tension already happening in the Ukraine based on those forces that take place, which does bring us into 2014. Viktor Yanukovych, he's ousted. There's some protests that are taking place. His government is eventually toppled. Cue the Russians. The Russians decide that this is an opportune time to capitalize on the unrest. They annex Crimea, they take it back as they believe, and they start arming the eastern border, the border between the Ukraine and Russia, and they arm that border for purposes in which they would again like to cash in on this favorable environment. And the Ukraine crisis continues to exist at this moment. Just read an article on it, they were referring to Europe's forgotten war. A lot of people do forget that it is continuing on at this moment, but we're not going to forget about that. This is super important, and so we're going to continue to talk about it as the course continues to move on. Even when we move out of Europe, Russia, and the post-Soviet states, we'll continue to follow these conflicts that do become ongoing, just to keep tabs on it and keep the discussion alive for their relationships in and around the world. But that's sort of where things stand at this moment. Another, again, a point of contention at this moment, frozen conflict, if you will. And that brings us to the conflict in Chechnya. If you haven't been following along at this point, and it's going to be continuing on a little bit more, there's a lot of conflicts when we're talking about Russia and the former Soviet Union. I'm not an expert on this specific region or anything, but certainly a conflict-prone an area, and that's probably because refer to the Russians as meddlers and instigators and aggressors in a lot of contexts. They're usually where the trouble is, and we will refer to that again when it's time to talk about Syria, and we're going to talk about other places around the world, sort of when there's problems going on. Russia isn't far away. So historically, a resistant of Moscow continually would seek independence, this region of Chechnya. And Chechnya was an oblast, or a region within the Russian Federation. You can see it borders Georgia and obviously located in Russia. Some notable conflicts would be in 1942, during World War II. The Chechens, the people of Chechnya, the Chechens decide it's a good time to take on the Soviets through guerrilla warfare and try to declare their independence while maybe catch the Soviets off guard. It doesn't go well. They certainly do not succeed, and many of them are exiled into the hundreds of thousands, exiled into Siberia by our comrade, Joseph Stalin. In 1957, some of them return. They're able to return, but obviously labeled as traitors to the Soviet Union, and that certainly affects their daily life. Stigmatized or labeled in a negative context, and so that becomes a problem. In 1991, the Soviet Union falls. Chechens see this as a time to declare independence again. Again, it does not go well. This is a very small area against the entire force of the Russian Federation. It does not go well. The Russians beat them back, and so it remains this area in contention with certain political and economical autonomy, but at the same time part of the Russian Federation. They continue to act out and to protest this, again, to become resistant of Moscow. Terrorist attacks have fueled Russian xenophobia in this area and more generally speaking from those in the entire Caucasus region. Now, this is my connection to the movie 12 that I have you watch. Again, why are we watching it? I'll tell you why. I didn't really expect that I would have to tell you why or why we were watching it. I thought maybe you'd connect the dots. Some of you wondering why in the world are we watching these movies? Well, it makes sense with Charlie Wilson's War. Should have made sense with The Favelas and City of God. And it certainly should make sense here once you watch 12. Long movie, like 2 hours and 40 minutes long. Apologies for that. But again, ties it all together. It's better than the other movie. that I was having you watch. Not going to say the name of it in case one of their producers catches my video and sues me for defamation or something, so we'll leave them out of it, but not a good movie. But anyways, you'll see this xenophobia on display in the movie 12 in a great way within the jurors that have this discussion regarding the Chechens. And again, fascinating, not the most riveting movie in the world. I wouldn't say it's the most entertaining film in the world. Better than what I did before. But again, you'll see what I'm talking about here. This conflict in Chechnya. Pay attention in the movie 12. Again, 12 from 2007. There's another movie by that name. And so pay attention to this. You'll see this on display in the movie, and I really can't explain it any better than what you'll see when you watch that movie and take that movie quiz on it, and it'll sort of come together for you. We'll talk about it a little bit more later to tie it all together. In terms of that terroristic activity, the Tsarnaev brothers from the Boston Marathon bombings in 2013 come from this region, and so that terrorism isn't just present in this region, specifically in Russia, but joined a larger movement of violence inspired by radicalization around the world, there in the United States as well. Another conflict involving the Russians, the conflict in Georgia. So we have two regions here of noteworthiness: South Ossetia and Abkhazia, part of Georgia. That comes in the time of Joseph Stalin. He puts these places in Georgia. Again, Stalin was a native of Georgia, this region of the USSR, of the Soviet Union. It's now an independent country, a post-Soviet state, its own independent country. However, certainly conflicts exist with the Russians in this region and the people of Georgia. The Russians support these minorities in these two areas to secede from Georgia. I almost lost my clicker. Got too fired up here. So they try to support those movements because it tries to destabilize Georgia. And then, of course, when there's destabilization that takes place, anytime that there's trouble, Russians show up under the guise of trying to help or protect their people, but of course always try to find what's in the best interest of Vladimir Putin or the Russians. And so in 2008, the Georgian military engages with the Russian army, and of course we have a conflict that takes place. At this time, Georgia does not have control of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, nor truly does the Russians. And so what we refer to this as a frozen conflict, sort of a military limbo, a geopolitical limbo. And so, again, kind of like the way Ukraine has worked out, kind of like this idea here in Georgia, and just a lot of uncertainty and a lot of tension and conflict. And you can see why it's pretty challenging for these areas to be leaders in terms of free and fair elections, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, booming economies, high life expectancies, and all these things that we would expect from the Western world. Even though this region is transitioning from the developing world and trying to make that next step, these conflicts continually pull them back away from why they can't really join the EU, why they can't really become that player in Europe, certainly because they're being dragged back because of some of these conflicts that take place. Again, not maybe great to be in such proximity to the Russian Federation. Now we have our comrade Vladimir Putin. He's the fourth and current president of Russia. He succeeded Boris Yeltsin in 2000, serving until 2008 as well. So he was president. He was the second president of Russia, 2000-2008. He leaves, becomes prime minister, and Dmitry Medvedev becomes president. And then Putin comes back, probably was never really out of power. He was probably, Dmitry was probably just a puppet for him. And he's back in power, back in control, back to horseback riding, shirtless as the leader of the Russian Federation, and doing all the things that he does. A little story that I read is that Angela Merkel, very afraid of dogs, fun fact. I don't know if that's fun, but it's a fact. He comes to Germany, he brings his dog to sort of intimidate her. I don't know exactly where I was going with that, but sort of noteworthy. I mean, again, these little stories that take place. I wasn't there in the room or anything, so I'm trusting the journalists that write this up. Actually, a quotation from Angela Merkel that I read in this publication. But again, just never ceases to amaze someone of the small little petty things that sometimes world leaders will do. Powerful people, just to get an edge in some discussions. Anyways, there he is. This is sort of the political leadership situation right now in Russia. Vladimir Putin, current leader, current instigator, current meddler, current aggressor, kind of conflict riser. And so that's where it stands right now. He is President, Medvedev as Prime Minister. That brings us to urbanization. Moscow, Russia, population of 12 million people in a country of about 144 million people. So it's considered a primate city, largely because those people gravitating to the European side of Russia because of the geographic and climatic challenges to that of Eastern Russia. Housing shortages exist in Moscow. Prices are on par with major global cities like Tokyo and New York City because of these housing shortages. Very expensive city to live in, therefore. Central Asian states, only about 47% urbanized. That's less than the global average of 53%. However, a stark contrast to the difference, well, you see countries like Moldova, Belarus, the Ukraine, and Russia are more to the tune of 70% urbanized, so quite different than the Central Asian states, and they sort of lag behind even the rest of the world. Picture there, Moscow, not labeled, Moscow. Population and gender, put this even together in this slide. Life expectancy of Russia slightly up over the last few years, went from about 70 years old to about 72, 72.5. That's nearing some record highs for them. Not incredibly great when you're comparing it to the rest of the developed world. In fact, when you consider it to the developed world, it's the low. Total fertility rate is 1.78 in the country of Russia, less than replacement value of about 2.1, as we know. And so, again, not a growing country, or at least not a growing country to the level of massive growth. Growing for different reasons. Maybe certain regions are growing because of a migration in and around the country taking place, but certainly not a country that has experienced rapid growth as an entire country. Right now, gender, critical issue, presently and ongoing. Within Russia, I wouldn't say, obviously the region as well has this issue within these contexts of gender, just based on their human rights track record, overall corruption, and lack of free and fair elections. But specifically speaking in the context of Russia, they've been in the news. The region of Chechnya, there was said to be a purge of homosexuals, specifically men, that were beaten and imprisoned, been investigated. Human Rights Watch confirms that this has been taking place. This is was sort of picked up on the news in 2017, so last year, very recently. So that's sort of a target of the of that particular community, the LGBTQ community. And then they talk about the issue of trafficking, human trafficking in the book for sex work. That in the book mentions it. About 140,000 girls are estimated to be smuggled into Europe, mostly from countries like the Ukraine, for a $3 billion industry in Europe. And so, again, this is an issue that's facing gender as a precarious situation to these specific communities, whether women or the LGBTQ community. And so these obviously need to be taken care of if and so those in power are willing, and that's to be foreseen. Usually in these situations they're very complacent and they let these things take place. So that wraps it up for the human section, broadly speaking, and that'll leave us to the subregions, which is going to be even faster. And again, record time, I think it's like 29 minutes or so. So we're doing fantastic. It's going to be a quick one, and on to subregions coming up next.